My name is Jaimie Mcevoy. I'm a city councillor in New Westminster, British Columbia, and I'm talking today about our city's implementing the first living wage policy in Canada. The living wage policy in New Westminster was part of an overall effort to address poverty in the community through the powers of our city. And our city was ready for the living wage because of the work that we'd already been doing. We had a Homelessness Coalition, which was a coalition sponsored by the city to bring together all the groups and people in the city who were interested in this issue, whatever their perspective was. When we arrived at the living wage policy, it wasn't a surprise that the City Council was looking at issues of poverty or how economics affects people's daily lives in the city. It was something that we had worked towards and built up to so that it almost seemed natural when we got to that stage. I think it's important in municipal politics that we really think about the relevance to the community. We know we have to do a good job on sidewalks and sewers, and we can't lose sight of those things. But what's core? And what does the community care about? When you start to look at the community, it's not just New Westminster. In New Westminster, 55% of our people are renters, are already concerned and thinking about housing issues. 1/3 of the population lives below the poverty line, is already thinking about and concerned about those issues. We have a large number of part-time workers in the city, and we have a large number of students. So looking at housing and wages, it's something our people want our politicians to do at all levels. It's something that people care about and something that people are affected by. Introducing the living wage in New Westminster was something that I wanted to be successful. So it was important to plan for it and not be reckless. We wanted to capture the idealism on the one hand and still have the strategy on the other. And the first step was to look at studies on the living wage for other cities, look at the work that the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives did, and we requested a city study as our first step on the living wage before we made any initial decisions. We worked on the issue of staff education and buy-in from the bureaucracy at City Hall by meeting with staff, talking about it, encouraging staff to meet with representatives of the Living Wage Campaign and the CCPA. We talked to media, and we talked to media ahead of time so that there wouldn't be this sort of spontaneous and potentially negative coverage of what was happening with this living wage issue at City Hall. We wanted to be sure that people understood what a living wage was. We wanted to be sure that people understood what it was not, which is that it was not some special minimum wage just for New Westminster. And we wanted people to know the formula and the arguments for the living wage because it's not something everybody thinks of. The terminology is new to a lot of people. And we talked to community groups before we formally introduced living wage policy. Progressive community groups, but other community groups as well, seniors community groups. And you know, seniors are really important because, and so are childcare groups, because there's moral elements to this issue, as well as economic arguments. And those groups are well equipped to address the issue and are credible in a way. You know, we have to be fair to admit, us politicians, that, you know, when individuals come forward who are affected by an issue, other members of the public can identify with that. We had a staff report come to City Council that looked at the living wage. And in reality, this first staff report was pretty negative. The first staff report was responsive to the whole idea of something new. There was some concern whether a small town could pull off a living wage policy, given that the examples had come from bigger cities. And so we had to work with that and address that concerns. And I think that was good, because by going through that process of having a staff report come forward, having research done, it equipped us better to make sure that we knew what we were doing and that we had the arguments going forward. We also talked about the human element, and I think we need to return to this more in progressive politics. We all have a reason, often personal reasons or family reasons, why we're involved, and we often make arguments that appeal to economic cases and that sort of thing. But what is the human element? And the human element here is that there are people who've had their wages frozen effectively for many years and have had to try to get by, individuals with names and individuals with jobs. So I asked people in my community, I said, when you go to the library, for example, do you say hello to the librarian? And most people say yes. I say hi to the librarian. I said, well, do you say hi to the security guard? The guy who's standing there, the Indo-Canadian guy, he's been working there for many years. Do you say hi to him? And most people say, well, no. We then arrived at the issue of the adoption of the policy. By the time we were ready to adopt the policy, and there's several months of work between when the concept was first floated to the public in the form of a study and the adoption of a living wage policy in New Westminster, we were able to adopt that policy unanimously at our city council, and I'm very proud that we did that. But it took a lot of work. It took a lot of cups of coffee with other councillors. It took a lot of conversations. It took a lot of people coming forward who are affected by what has been 10 years of frozen minimum wages in British Columbia. The real issue here is, do we accept responsibility for what we do as a city government? I'll tell you, every politician once a year goes through the process around the table of looking at their own compensation, their own benefits, and determining if that's fair. We also do it for our senior staff, for our administration, and it's right that we do it. We also do it for our unionized employees. We look at whether people are being fairly compensated and being treated decently as workers. When I hear the argument that it would hurt the economy to increase the minimum wage, or it would hurt the budget to increase the wages for the people at the bottom, it really makes me a little angry, because the argument is being made, sometimes unintentionally, that it's the people at the bottom who should pay and continue to pay, that their wages are the ones that can't be moved. When everybody around you is getting some kind of increases on an annual basis, at least to keep up with inflation, we have responsibility for that. City councils aren't neutral on the issues of wages. We deal with wages and compensation all the time. And when people step forward and say, well, we shouldn't be dealing with wages and compensation when it comes to a living wage, or the wages of the people who are at the bottom, that's something we really have to think about in terms of how we've arrived there as a society and how we accept that. There was opposition, and the opposition was interesting, because there was some concern from people in the business community who felt they should have been consulted more. There was still some misunderstanding about what we were doing in terms of it applying to people who do work for the city, whether through wages or contract. And there were some letters to the editor. Letters to the editor that said things like, as a business person struggling to survive in a city which supports socialism over business, I am adamantly opposed to City Council meddling in the wage issues of the community. And another one, if the city wants to engage in such communistic ideals. And what I say to that is, it's interesting, because I do a lot of charity work in New Westminster. I'm employed by the United Church, and I run some charitable services, and I deal a lot with our city's food bank. A food bank that provides food for between 1% to 2% of the city. The largest food bank in British Columbia, handing out 500 bags of food a week. And I do a lot of other charitable work in the city through other nonprofits. And when I do that work, dealing with the symptoms, everybody is in support of that. Everybody is in favor of that. But when I do the work of looking at why are people poor, and is that really necessary, and what can we do about it through public policy? You know, what I never realized was what a touchstone wage issues are for the right wing. And that's fine, because it's a touchstone for the average person too, and it's something we need to address. It reminded me of the famous statement by Archbishop Helder Camara, "When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist."